100 renewable energy is possible, and I came from Japan to talk about the future of renewable energy today based on my recent work over the last 2 years. In Japan, the Fukushima nuclear accident 2 years ago had a profound effect, not just in Japan, but around the world. And we have seen that all nuclear power plants in Japan were shut down for most of the first year. A couple have been restarted. There are going to be more plants being restarted now. But I'm giving talks in Japan basically with the message that nuclear power is not necessary for the future of Japan, really for the future of the world. We can do everything with renewable energy that nuclear can do. The same functionality is possible, and 100% renewables is possible without any nuclear. So I think that's an important message, not just for Japan, but for everyone around the world. So I'm going to talk about the REN 21 Renewables Global Futures Report and the future of renewable energy. One of the important messages from this report is that our thinking about the future of renewable energy, how we think about what's possible and where we are today, is really out of date. We're 5, 10, 15, 20 years out of date with reality of where renewable energy is today and with the future as seen through the current situation, current thinking, current understanding. And you know, a lot of people are still thinking about renewable energy like it's 1990 or the year 2000 even. So I think we should keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about this report. I spent the last 2 years interviewing 170 leading experts around the world. I asked them the question, what do you think about the future of renewable energy? I ended up with about 1,000 pages of handwritten interview notes. We also looked at all of the recently published scenarios, about 5,000 pages of recently published scenarios about the future of renewable energy, the future of energy, and that's all put together into this 40-page report. There are copies on the table back there. You can also get it from ren21.net and my own website, martinot.info. If you Google Renewable Energy Eric, then my website, my information site will come up first, and you can find this report and many other publications. I think another important message from the report is that it's not a question of technology anymore. It's not a question of economics. It's really a question of policy, of finance, of business models, of market development, of a whole lot of other kinds of social issues. But the technologies are there. We have all the technologies we need already to achieve a high renewables future. We don't have to wait for technology development. And the economics are there and coming soon to virtually all of the technologies. So it's really not a question of economics. I'll talk about policy at the end, but if we think about policies for renewable energy over the last 20 years, a lot of them or most of them have been directed at prices and costs, and that's going to change. In the future, we're going to see a whole transformation of the policy landscape focused on other things besides the economics, besides the cost and pricing. Before I talk about the future of renewable energy, however, let me just give you a current status of where we stand today. So I started writing the Renewables Global Status Report in 2005. I created this report, and it became an annual international standard publication every year. And the most recent version, 2012, is what I'll give you now. The 2013 version is coming in June from REN 21. So if you look at the current status of renewable energy around the world today, you find, first of all, that renewables are supplying about 17% share of total global energy. That's about half modern renewables, about half traditional biomass, so-called fuel wood, dung, charcoal, agricultural waste in rural areas of developing countries. But the modern renewables share, that 8%, is growing very fast. That's wind, that's biomass, that's solar, hydro, geothermal, and others. Renewable energy supplies about 20% of global electricity today. That's 15% from hydro and 5% from all the other renewables, and that 5% is growing very fast. And that 15% from hydro is slightly more than the energy we get, than the electricity we get from nuclear power. So hydro and nuclear are about the same, and then this 5% other renewables is what is growing very fast, and that's what I'm going to talk mostly about today. Wind power has been growing by 25 to 30% annually for the last 7 or 8 years, and we're up to about 280 gigawatts as of the end of last year. The statistics for 2012 will be out in June. These graphs only go to 2011, but basically we're up to about 280 gigawatts as of the end of last year. And just to put that in some perspective, that's about 5% of total global power capacity. So total global power capacity from all forms is about 5,200 gigawatts. In the US, it's about 900 gigawatts, the whole power system. So 280 gigawatts from wind power. A lot of the growth in the last 5-6 years has been in China. We've seen a huge explosion of the wind power market in China from virtually nothing in 2005. I lived in Beijing for 3 years, 2005 to 2008, until the air pollution got to be so bad that I had to leave for health reasons. And that was even then. But today China is the global leader in wind power, and they became that in just the last 6 or 7 years from virtually nothing. And they did that, why? Because they wanted to be the industrial leader in the world in terms of this technology. They saw it as a strategic technology like aerospace, like defense technology, and they wanted to become the industrial leader of the world in wind power, and they have done that in a very, very short period of time, and that's reflected partly in this graph. Solar PV, solar electric power, has been growing by 50-60% annually, also for the last 7 or 8 years. Global capacity almost doubled in 2011 from 40 to 70 gigawatts. We're up to about 100 gigawatts of solar PV as of the end of last year. 100 gigawatts, again, compared to 5,200 gigawatts global total power capacity from all forms of electricity generation, fossil fuels, nuclear, et cetera. And the solar PV growth has been concentrated in just a few countries. Germany, Italy, Spain, the US, Japan, but we're seeing much broader growth now in a growing number of countries, and we're seeing this continued very, very fast-growing market, the fastest-growing energy technology in the world. Growth rates that we've seen for all renewable technologies, 15, 20, 30, 50% annual growth rates for the last 7-8 years and longer. In terms of investment, it would probably surprise you to learn that for the last 3 years running, more money has been invested in renewable energy capacity than in fossil fuel and nuclear power combined. So if you had asked people, some years ago when this would happen, they might have guessed 2020 or something, but this has actually been true since 2010, that more money has been invested annually in renewable energy capacity than fossil fuel and nuclear. Renewables are now receiving the majority of investment in power generation capacity around the world, and that's up to about $260 billion in 2011, a little bit less last year, but that's a 6-fold increase from 2004. So we're seeing a huge increase in investment volumes. And that is also not distributed evenly. It is concentrated in a few countries. The US actually was not an investment leader some years ago, but has become that because of wind and solar PV both. And we see the US and China being the two leaders. This is out of the $260 billion investment. And when I say, that our thinking about renewable energies in the past, what I'm also referring to is, the fact that we don't appreciate how much of this investment, in Europe last year, 80% of added power capacity was renewable energy. So this investment picture is really suggesting and showing that renewables have become not just mainstream, not just, on a par with other technologies with fossil fuels and nuclear, but actually leading ahead of fossil fuels and nuclear, and particularly in Europe. The final piece of the current picture is policy. So when I started writing the Global Status Report in 2005, there were about 50 countries, mostly Europe and some other developed countries, with policies to support renewable energy. Today, there are over 120 countries around the world with policies to promote renewable energy, and most of those are now developing countries. So the policy support for renewables has become very, very broad-based in a whole range of countries. You can't read this table, but you can find 5 tables like it in the Renewables Global Status Report, which basically is showing you across the top the 10 most common policies to support renewable energy, like feed-in tariffs, portfolio standards, and which policies exist in which countries. This is the table of the most developed, richest countries. You can see that most countries have more than one policy, that it's a multiplicity of policies. For example, in the US, the combination of the production tax credit and the renewable portfolio standard has really been the driving force for renewables markets here, a lot of the markets. So the policy picture has also evolved. You find also 120 countries with targets for future shares of renewable energy, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that just gives you a very quick run-through of the current status. You can find a lot more in the report. As they say, it's on the ren21.net website. But it really suggests that, our thinking about where renewables stands, most people would be very surprised to hear some of this information. They just would have no idea that this was really what's going on today. So now let me turn to the future. So after all of those interviews and reviewing all those scenarios, and okay, what does the report say? Well, I managed to condense it all into 40 pages. As I say, it's on the back table there. It took me 2 years. You can read it in 2 hours. It really paints an amazing picture if you read the whole thing through in terms of what is our current thinking. Again, the report is not my idea. It's the ideas of 170 leading experts, including CEOs of major renewable energy companies, finance experts. I went to New York and London, researchers, policymakers, those practicing a variety of fields around renewables. First of all, how much renewables do people see in the future, both scenarios and experts? How much should we see? Well, I think in considering this question, it's worth recognizing that historic projections have fallen very short. So in the year 2000, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, projected that wind power would reach 35 gigawatts by the year 2010. In fact, we reached 200 gigawatts by the year 2010, so they were 6 times too low in their forecast of where wind power would go within 10 years. The World Bank in 1997 projected only 6 gigawatts of wind power in China by 2020. And in fact, China achieved 60 gigawatts by 2010 or 2011. So in fact, the World Bank's projection was not only a factor of 10 too low, but it happened actually in actuality a decade earlier than they had projected. So you can find a lot of projections from 10 years ago that were either a factor of 10 too low or happened actually in actuality a decade earlier than projected. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Now, if you look at all the scenarios that have been published, you can sort of group them into 3 categories we call conservative, moderate, and high renewables. So you can see the low category, the yellow lines are 15 to 20% share of total global energy by future year 2030, 2040, 2050. And these have tended to be by oil companies, by the International Energy Agency, the IEA itself, by departments of energy like U.S. Department of Energy. And they tended to be very conservative, but this has been the historic, credible view of renewables at that range. But that's actually the same level that we're at today. Remember, I said 17% share today is where we are. So those scenarios are really sort of projecting sort of maintenance of the status quo in terms of share of renewables. But you find now an increasing number of scenarios in the moderate category, which are 30 to 50% share of renewables in the long term. And here you have a scenario by the IEA, the ETP, Energy Technology Perspectives, and the IEA was not known historically for aggressive or high renewable scenarios, but they've started to come out with them as part of this ETP report they now do every 2 years. And this is a climate-constrained scenario, 2 degrees of global warming by 2050, and it shows a 45% share of electricity, 45% share of total energy, including transport, heating, and cooling from renewables. And you find a lot of other scenarios now in this moderate category. And then you find, of course, many scenarios now in the high category, which are basically 50 to 80% share of total global energy. And you would expect Greenpeace is there, of course, but an increasing number of other scenarios are also in that category of very high shares. The GEA is shown here, Global Energy Assessment, which was a major scientific study, took 5 years, hundreds of people involved. They came out with a whole series of scenarios, including one that was 75% share of total global energy from renewables. So one of the takeaways from this, which actually is not stated explicitly in the report, but basically I will tell you that when you read through Chapter 1, when you read through the report and you see this, you can't help but think and understand that the conservative, the yellow scenarios, the conservative scenarios are simply no longer tenable. They don't hold up. They're no longer credible in view of where renewables are today and where renewables are expected to go by not just experts in scenarios, but just the trends that we're seeing, the market trends, the price trends, the technology trends, the implementation trends. Those low scenarios simply can't be defended anymore. So instead, we're really looking at least starting from the moderate scenarios, at least starting from we're going to get to 30, 50%, no question. Then the question is, can we reach the higher levels, 50, 60, 70, 80% and above share of renewables in the long term? That's really the question for us today. Can we go above 50%? I think getting towards 50% is no longer really an issue or a question when you really look at this and when you really understand the trends. And to reinforce that, this is showing just share of electricity by itself, not including heating, cooling, and transport. And you can see for the EU, for example, the European Commission itself projects 35% share of electricity for all of Europe by 2030. The IEA is projecting 45% share of electricity for all of Europe by 2030. The EREC, which is an industry group, is projecting 65% share of electricity in Europe by 2030. And you find a lot of projections in these ranges. If you look at Germany, these are not projections. These darker gray lines, the light blue, the blue-gray lines for Germany, these are targets. So Germany has a target, a policy target of 80% electricity from renewables by 2050. Stepwise, 35% by 2020, 50% by 2030, and then 80% share of electricity by 2050. So when I say that the low scenarios are no longer credible, if the government of Germany says it is going to achieve 80% share of electricity by 2050, then okay, you have to believe that we can reach much higher levels. This is really credible now that many governments around the world have targets in the range of 30 to 50% shares of either total energy or just electricity. We find targets for 30%, 40%, 50%. Denmark is targeting 100% of electricity from renewables in I think it's 2040, 2050. And even developing countries now have targets in these higher ranges. So when I say that our thinking is out of date, it's the fact that country governments themselves are now committing to these things. California has its own 33% renewable portfolio standard by 2020. Shows that we really are going into the upper ranges clearly. In terms of the U.S., just in terms of power capacity, very briefly, if you look at this table, you can see a whole range of projections of power capacity in the U.S. by future years. You can see, for example, that wind power is projected to increase from about 50 gigawatts in 2011 to 500 gigawatts in 2050, or 10-fold increase according to the Emory Levin's RMI reinventing fire scenario. Solar PV is projected to increase from 4 gigawatts to 500 gigawatts, or a 100-fold increase according to the Levin's RMI scenario. But even other scenarios, IEA is showing a 20-fold or 30-fold increase. You find many scenarios now projecting large increases in total power capacity in the U.S. And this Department of Energy DOE projection that solar PV is going to increase from 4 gigawatts to 8 gigawatts by 2030, according to the Annual Energy Outlook by DOE IEA. How can you defend that? I mean, that's essentially a doubling of solar PV in 20 years, when in fact, we're probably going to see that in the next 5 years or less. So, and the U.S. is actually a relatively small market for solar PV relative to Europe and even Japan right now. In terms of shares of heating and transport, the story is a little bit different. I've been talking mostly about electricity, but if you look at projections for shares of heating and cooling or shares of transport by a variety of global scenarios, the heating side is much more difficult. It's going to be much more difficult. It's not uncertain. We can do it. We have all the technologies we need to have high shares of renewables for heating and cooling, and I'll get to that. But it's going to take a long time because of the changes necessary in building practices and codes and standards and construction techniques and building materials and all sorts of things. We're talking about decades and decades of change to get higher shares of renewables in the heat supply sector. In transport, what experts basically said is this is very uncertain. How far we're going to be able to go in terms of shares of renewable energy for transport depends on the use of electricity for electric vehicles, depends on the use of advanced biofuels beyond the current generation of biofuels, and those advanced biofuel technologies are not necessarily commercial yet. So the transport shares are the most uncertain, the heating shares are going to be the most difficult, and the electricity shares are really the most straightforward and the most understandable, and really not nearly as much question about share of electricity. Okay, enough about how much renewables. Now, just a word about investment. When I talked to finance experts and asked them about the future of investments, got very interesting ideas, projections. Most experts said that investment in renewable energy annually is going to double, if not by 2020, then by 2025 or 2030. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, BNEF, projects $400 billion investment in renewables by 2020. That's up from the $260 billion where we are today. And the Greenpeace scenario the revolution scenario is showing basically $1 trillion average annual investment over the next 20 years. So $20 trillion invested in renewable energy over the period through 2030. However, finance experts said we're going to need new sources of finance. The existing sources of finance will not be able to cover those increased levels of investment. We're currently getting most of the finance from bank lending, from utility balance sheet finance, but many other sources of finance will have to come in, but that will happen. Pension funds, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds, even oil companies potentially investing, community funds at the local level, a lot happening now in terms of local community investment. And one of the things that's going to unlock some of these sources is the perception that renewable energy is actually the lowest risk energy technology. It's certainly lower risk than coal power in many places, particularly Germany, where coal plants are having to ramp and cycle daily because solar PV is providing half of the daytime peak demand, and so the coal plants are having to ramp down, the operators are losing revenue, in danger of going bankrupt. And so if you own a coal plant, it's very risky, both in terms of future coal prices and in terms of your ability to sell all of your power, given the increased growth of renewables, this collision between too much renewables or so much renewables that we have to curtail the output of existing plants. And there's a whole slew of issues involved in that, but the basic message is that the risk of renewable energy is going to be seen to be lower than most other conventional technologies, certainly than nuclear. And once pension funds and other investors begin to realize this, this will really unlock things. Experts also talked about a variety of business models that we're going to need to see, that need to be developed, that are going to come in to the picture. Not clear how that's going to happen. There are a variety of possibilities. There's not a lot of detail in the report about these, but it's interesting to think about new kinds of business models. Okay, now to achieve high shares, Chapter 2 of the report is really a key part of the report about the integration of renewable energy with the power sector, with industry, with buildings, with transport. And this integration question, sort of how do renewables get integrated into these various sectors at high levels? So first of all, integration into power grids. There is a whole range of options available for integrating large shares of variable renewables, solar and wind, into power grids and managing that variability. A lot of utilities are calling this flexibility now. When I started this work, I thought, well, we really need energy storage. That's really going to be the key to unlocking large shares of renewables. And that's a common perception, a common understanding around the world. In Japan, basically renewables is equated with energy storage. You must have energy storage to go along with renewables, and therefore renewables are very expensive because energy storage is still very expensive. Many oil companies talk about the need to wait for energy storage technology breakthroughs before large shares of renewables can be used, et cetera. But the real message is that all of these options for balancing variable renewables exist today. They're being used already today around the world by utilities. They're already being done. And energy storage is just a small part of this. So you can find scenarios, including by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, in the US, by RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, which show large shares of renewables, 80% share of electricity from renewables in both scenarios, without large amounts of energy storage, using other balancing measures, demand response, and all sorts of, and other things on here. So this is really, utilities around the world are starting to explore this. Certainly in Germany, they're really tackling these things now. Many utilities in Denmark are already leading in these areas. Other utilities are going to have to follow, or if they don't, they're going to be left behind. So that's in terms of integration of power. In terms of integration of renewable energy into transport, there are a variety of options. Experts and scenarios talk about a whole range of vehicle types, 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 4 wheels, small cars, large cars. Basically a transition from, away from this sort of one vehicle size fits all, where we have this paradigm now where basically all cars are the same, to a paradigm where we have a multiplicity of different vehicle types, vehicle fuels for different modes, new models of transport, of mobility, of ownership, of operation that allow for all these issues to sort of fit range questions and ownership questions and use questions, and that this is really going to allow the integration of renewables at large shares in terms of electric transport, particularly passenger transport. On the other hand, biofuels and advanced biofuels then round out the picture in terms of getting high shares of transport energy from renewables. In terms of integration into buildings, we find a whole range of options that already exist. All the technologies already exist for high shares of heating and cooling for buildings, solar thermal, geothermal, heat pumps, biomass stoves, pellets, passive heat storage. The key here is passive, low energy or zero energy construction so that you don't need much energy to begin with. And that's really the prerequisite at the beginning. And we're going to need to see this transformation of the building sector to low energy, zero energy buildings, to new forms of architecture that incorporate these principles, that incorporate renewables. Solar thermal, for example, for cooling or building cooling is very viable. You can integrate it with existing heating, ventilating, air conditioning systems, HVAC systems, but you have to do it when the building is constructed, not afterwards as a retrofit. It's much more expensive afterwards. And so how do we integrate this into our practices, into our codes and standards and normal everyday construction practices? So that's really the issue here, not the technology. I'm out of time, but one of the really interesting things to come from the report is the role of many different kinds of companies. So if you really look through it, you can find that existing companies have a large role in the future. The future of renewable energy is not just about wind power manufacturers or solar PV manufacturers, but it's about all these kinds. It's about ordinary electric utilities becoming sophisticated power grid managers, not just suppliers of a commodity, electricity, kilowatt hours. Oil companies getting into the game, not just in terms of finance and biofuels, but in terms of offshore wind power, for example. A lot of the cost of offshore wind power, 2/3 of the cost, is not the cost of the turbine, but the cost of the logistics, the maintenance, the operations, the construction. And oil companies are very good at offshore logistics and operation, and oil companies could actually reduce the cost of offshore wind power considerably if they got into this game. Automakers, I mentioned their role in a whole new range of vehicle types, the whole concept of vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, running your house off your car, all of that integrating with electric grids for variability and so on. The role of IT companies, really amazing. All kinds of roles for IT companies, not just smart grids, but wind turbine siting and maintenance. There's hundreds of monitoring points on any given wind turbine now, very, very sophisticated. And then finally, the role of building material manufacturers in developing new building materials that integrate renewable energy into the material itself. Just a few words about the local level. We're finding cities around the world are engaged in renewable energy policy and in actions and in market development. You find a whole slew of cities, hundreds of cities now literally have policies to support renewable energy. The EU Covenant of Mayors has over 4,000 signatories now that have committed to action plans for reducing carbon emissions, including action plans for renewable energy. And you find examples all over the place. Munich, Germany is targeting 100% of electricity supply from renewable energy for the entire city, 100%, either through their own investments in local facilities or through investments in renewable facilities around Europe with an accounting mechanism to account for that. The city of Copenhagen in Denmark is planning 100% of heat supply to the entire city from biomass through district heating systems. Amsterdam is engaged in low energy building codes. The team in Brazil is requiring that all of their city buses and taxis use biodiesel. So you just find many, many examples. I could go on. Literally hundreds of cities are doing all sorts of things to promote renewable energy. A lot is happening at the local level. In fact, in some places like in Germany, and I would even say in Japan, the local level is really leading in some ways the charge towards renewables and high shares of renewables. You find many cities in Germany, and I think we'll hear from that later, which are targeting 100% renewables, and in the long term is sort of the 100% paradigm. And you find increasing numbers of local regions and local communities that are saying we want to be 100% renewable. The last chapter of the report involves technology evolution, costs, long-term market development. I won't talk about this except to say for solar PV, the cost reduction has been phenomenal. The cost has come down by a factor of 3 in just the last 4 or 5 years. When I say we don't really appreciate how things have changed, the cost of solar PV is now below $1 per watt. And those of us who were around in the 1980s may remember that in the 1980s, and I've been working in renewables for 25 years now, in the 1980s, $1 per watt was called the holy grail of solar PV. Once we reach $1 per watt, the game is over. You see solar PV everywhere. We're actually below $1 per watt in 1980 dollars. If you account for inflation, we're actually at like 50 cents per watt already in 1980s dollars. So we've already gone beyond that level. And you're seeing this concept of grid parity. The cost of solar PV without any subsidy, without any policy support in terms of the cost becoming competitive with retail electricity prices in a growing number of locations around the world. Hawaii, for example, Spain, other parts of the world are now showing this idea of grid parity. And experts saw this wave of grid parity spreading around the world over the next 5 to 10 years, more and more locations where simply allowing that power to be sold at the retail price would be sufficient. In Germany, the feed-in tariff is already below the retail price of electricity, so they could get rid of the feed-in tariff and just have net metering instead, if you know what that is, and basically allow people to receive the retail price for their power. This is going to work now. And one of the really important things about this, about solar PV, is that it's no longer a question of the cost of the panel itself. The cost of the solar panel has really now become a very small part of the future equation. It's the installation cost, the labor, the materials, the frames. How do you reduce the cost of all of that? Integrating solar PV with building materials so you reduce installation cost and material cost. Building houses with the wiring pre-installed, reducing cost of inverters and balance of system and all the other things. All these other things are really now the important question for cost of solar power, not the cost of the panels themselves. We hear all these arguments about Chinese support of low-cost solar, Chinese-produced solar PV panels. The cost of the panels is really not the issue anymore. And I think this is the point is that the cost of renewables are really not the issue anymore. We can look at all the technologies, wind power, solar thermal is a little bit different case, geothermal, biomass, all of these technologies, cost is really becoming no longer the issue. It's all these other things, as I've said, policy, market development, finance, business models, community support, social issues. Finally, the report has a series of great debates, and you can find these throughout as boxes in the report, and there's about 30 of them in Annex 4 in the back. And these are questions that came up during the interviews, during the discussions. I'll leave you to read them, but I would just make the point in closing that it's really a new generation of policy that's going to sort of be behind all of these questions. Even the question number one, is renewable energy more expensive than conventional energy? It's a question of how we do the calculation and doing it from a risk-return perspective rather than from a cents per kilowatt-hour perspective as we've been doing it. But the future role of policy in the integration, in policies for integrating into power grids, into transport, into buildings and industry and so on, we're facing basically an entire new generation of policies which are not cost or price related like they have been in the past, but are related to all the other things that need to happen to get to high levels. So with that, I will close and invite you to work with me and envision with me a future towards 100% renewable energy. Thank you very much.